Raghav Malhotra was seen as a disciplined, invisible man, while Anaya existed as a presence no one knew was still alive, trapped beneath his home as decades passed above them. What connected their names was not family or fate, but a secret so carefully buried that it survived 30 years without discovery. As Raghav aged behind locked doors and routine prayers, Anaya endured a world without sunlight, time, or witnesses. One lived freely in plain sight. The other was erased without leaving the neighborhood. Their story did not begin with violence or end with rescue, but with silence so complete that the story began in a quiet Indian neighborhood where nothing ever seemed out of place. Rows of similar houses stood close together, and families followed the same daily routines for decades. One house, however, carried a silence that felt heavier than the rest. From the outside, it showed no sign of secrets. Curtains stayed drawn, doors remained locked, and the man who lived there was known as disciplined, religious, and strict. Neighbors respected him for his isolation and assumed he valued privacy above all else. No one questioned why no visitors ever stayed long or why no laughter was heard from inside. Beneath that ordinary home, hidden below thick concrete and rusted iron, existed a space never meant to be discovered. It was built slowly, over years, disguised as storage, then reinforced and sealed. The man believed control was the highest form of power, and he planned his life around that belief. Every step he took was calculated, every decision shaped by fear of exposure. He trusted no one and relied only on silence to protect him. Somewhere in that darkness lived a woman the world had forgotten. Time had erased her name from public memory, but she remained alive, counting days without calendars and years without sunlight. The outside world moved forward while she remained trapped in a moment that never ended. Above her, seasons changed, children grew into adults, and neighbors came and went without knowing what lay beneath their feet. What made the case so disturbing was not just the confinement, but how long it lasted. 30 years passed without a single alarm being raised. The man aged, the house decayed, and the secret grew heavier with every passing year. What finally exposed the truth was not courage or confession, but a small mistake that cracked open a nightmare no one was prepared to face. Life in the basement followed a pattern designed to erase hope. There were no clocks, no windows, and no way to measure time except by the sound of footsteps above. Light came only from a single bulb that flickered when the power weakened. Food arrived at irregular hours, just enough to survive, never enough to feel human. The man controlled every detail, believing unpredictability kept fear alive. Hunger, darkness, and silence became tools of domination. The woman learned quickly that resistance brought consequences. Over time, her body adapted to the cold floor and the damp air, but her mind struggled against the endless isolation. Days blended into weeks, and weeks disappeared into years. Memories of the outside world faded, replaced by routines meant to keep her alive but broken. She stopped expecting rescue and focused only on surviving each moment as it came. Above ground, the man lived a double life. To the world, he was ordinary and disciplined, known for keeping to himself. Inside the house, everything was controlled and measured. He reinforced locks, added layers of soundproofing, and checked the basement daily. His fear of discovery grew stronger with age, yet his confidence came from how long he had remained invisible. Each passing year without suspicion made him bolder. What no one understood was how the basement became its own closed universe. The woman's sense of time warped, and reality narrowed to the walls around her. She marked years by changes in her own body and the man's aging face. The outside world became something imagined rather than remembered. News, events, and progress meant nothing in that underground space. Still, small cracks formed in the man's control. Age slowed him, and routines became harder to maintain. Supplies were forgotten, doors were left unlocked for seconds too long, and exhaustion replaced precision. These minor failures, as the years continued, The basement changed in ways that reflected the slow collapse of control. The walls grew damp and cracked, and the air became heavier with neglect. What was once carefully maintained turned into a place of decay. The woman adapted to these changes with quiet endurance. Survival no longer depended on hope, but on instinct. She learned to listen closely to sounds above, identifying moods and routines through footsteps and silence. Her existence became smaller, shaped by repetition. The man's visits grew shorter and less predictable. Sometimes days passed without food, other times supplies arrived suddenly, dumped without care. These shifts created confusion, but they also revealed weakness. The careful planning that once defined him was slipping. Age brought fatigue, and fatigue led to mistakes. Locks were checked less often, and the strict order he once enforced began to break. Above ground, the house mirrored this decline. Paint peeled from the walls, and repairs were ignored. Neighbors noticed the decay, but assumed illness or poverty were to blame. The man withdrew further from the world, limiting contact and avoiding attention. His fear of discovery grew into obsession, yet he believed the years themselves had protected him. 30 years without exposure felt like proof that his secret would die with him. Below ground, the woman sensed change without understanding it fully. The silence felt different, heavier, but uncertain. She began to realize that time had weakened her captor more than it had destroyed her. Small details, once meaningless, now stood out. A door not fully secured, a delayed return, a dropped object left behind. These moments did not promise freedom, but they introduced something dangerous to the man's carefully built world: unpredictability. What had once been absolute control was slowly eroding. The turning point came quietly, without drama or warning. It began with a change in the woman's body and strength, shaped by years of confinement, but no longer entirely controlled by it. She had learned how to conserve energy, how to endure pain, and how to remain alert even when exhausted. What she had not expected was how the man's health would decline faster than her own. His movements became slower, his breathing heavier, and his routines less disciplined. The basement door was no longer checked with the same care. Once, it remained unlocked for several seconds longer than usual. Another time, the light stayed on when it should have been turned off. These details, once impossible, became more frequent. The man still believed fear alone was enough to maintain control, unaware that fear weakens when survival replaces terror. Above ground, changes were becoming visible to others. The man missed religious gatherings and stopped paying attention to neighbors. Deliveries piled up outside the house. A foul smell began to escape through vents that had not been cleaned in years. People noticed, but no one imagined the truth. Complaints were filed, ignored, and forgotten. Silence continued to protect the secret. Inside the basement, the woman began to prepare without knowing exactly what she was preparing for. She memorized the layout of the stairs through sound and vibration. She studied the locks and listened for changes in the house's rhythm. Hope remained dangerous, but awareness grew stronger. The years had taught her patience, and patience now became a weapon. What finally pushed the story toward exposure was not an act of courage, but neglect. A repair worker was scheduled to inspect a water leak near the house's foundation. The man postponed the visit twice, fearing discovery. On the third attempt, the worker arrived unannounced. That single moment, driven by routine maintenance, brought the outside world closer to the basement than it had ever been. The unplanned inspection changed everything. The repair worker noticed irregularities near the foundation, including sealed vents and unusual structural reinforcements that did not match the house's original design. These details raised concern, not suspicion of a crime, but enough to delay the visit and request further checks. The man attempted to regain control by restricting access to the property, but his behavior only drew more attention. What had remained invisible for decades was now being observed, even if no one yet understood its meaning. Inside the basement, the woman sensed disruption through unfamiliar vibrations and prolonged noise. Tools struck concrete, footsteps multiplied, and the air shifted with movement she had not felt in years. These changes broke the long-standing rhythm of isolation. The silence that once protected the man now worked against him. Each sound from above suggested presence, activity, and risk. Authorities were contacted under the assumption of unsafe construction. Their arrival was procedural, calm, and routine. No one expected to uncover a crime rooted in decades of secrecy. As inspections continued, sealed areas were questioned and access points were demanded. The man resisted, citing privacy and property rights, but the physical evidence left behind by years of concealment made refusal impossible. When the basement door was finally exposed, it revealed a reality too severe to ignore. The space showed clear signs of long-term human presence. Conditions that could not be explained by storage or neglect alone forced immediate escalation. Medical teams and investigators were called, and the house was secured. For the woman, the moment was not relief but disorientation. Light entered the basement in full strength for the first time in decades. The air felt unfamiliar, and movement around her replaced the silence she had known. What followed was not freedom in the way stories often describe. The discovery triggered a wave of consequences that spread far beyond the house. Investigators documented every detail, carefully reconstructing how the basement had remained hidden for so long. Structural changes revealed long-term planning, while records showed deliberate isolation from authorities and community life. The man's routine, once seen as harmless privacy, was now understood as intentional concealment. Each detail added weight to a case that stunned even experienced officials. Medical teams focused on stabilizing the woman's condition. Years of confinement had altered her physical strength and perception of the world. Simple sensations such as open space, natural light, and fresh air caused overwhelming reactions. Recovery was not immediate or dramatic. It was slow, measured, and uncertain. The outside world had changed completely, and adapting to it required more than freedom alone. As the investigation expanded, attention turned to how no one had noticed the signs earlier. Neighbors recalled odd smells, closed curtains, and the man's increasing isolation. These memories now carried guilt and disbelief. What once seemed ordinary was reinterpreted as warning signals ignored by routine and assumption. The case exposed how easily long-term abuse can exist in plain sight. Evidence confirmed that the confinement had lasted nearly 3 decades. The timeline shocked the public and challenged assumptions about safety within familiar spaces. Authorities struggled to understand how endurance, fear, and control had sustained the situation for so long. Psychological experts described the environment as one designed to erase identity and independence. The man was taken into custody without resistance. Age and illness had weakened him, but the evidence left no room for denial. His control ended not. As the case reached the public, reactions were intense and divided. News coverage focused on the length of the confinement rather than the details of daily abuse. The idea that someone could vanish while still living inside a neighborhood unsettled people across the country. Viewers searched for clear villains and simple answers, but the truth refused to fit into a neat explanation. The story exposed not just one man's crimes, but a pattern of ignored signs and collective distance. Court proceedings moved slowly. Evidence was technical and extensive, relying on structural records, medical reports, and timelines reconstructed from fragments. The absence of witnesses made the case unusual, yet the physical environment itself became proof. Experts explained how control can exist without constant force, sustained instead by isolation and dependency. This understanding challenged common beliefs about captivity and survival. The woman's recovery remained private, protected from public curiosity. Progress came in small steps rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Learning ordinary tasks, understanding modern technology, and adjusting to social spaces proved exhausting. Freedom brought choices, and choices carried fear. Years of control had reshaped how safety was understood. Healing became a process without a clear endpoint. Unexpected details emerged during the trial. Financial records showed years of careful planning, revealing how the man funded secrecy and avoided attention. His discipline, once admired, was reinterpreted as strategy. The image of an ordinary individual collapsed under the weight of evidence. What seemed like simplicity was revealed as calculation. The most disturbing realization came from how close discovery had been many times before. Inspections, complaints, and repairs had nearly exposed the basement. The final chapter of the case was not defined by a verdict alone, but by the lasting impact it left behind. The house was sealed and later demolished, its foundations examined and documented before being erased from the landscape. What once appeared ordinary was now remembered as a symbol of hidden cruelty. The neighborhood returned to routine, but the knowledge of what had existed beneath it could not be undone. The man's fate became a matter of record rather than mystery. Legal outcomes followed established procedures, but no sentence could measure the weight of time that had been taken. The years of planning, silence, and control were reduced to documents and evidence files. His power ended quietly, without the attention he had feared for so long. Exposure proved more final than any punishment. For the woman, the future remained complex and undefined. Survival did not erase the past, and recovery did not follow a straight path. Strength revealed itself through persistence rather than triumph. Each day brought new challenges, but also choices that had once been impossible. Her identity was no longer shaped by confinement, even though its effects remained. The case prompted broader changes. Authorities reviewed inspection protocols, and communities were encouraged to question assumptions about privacy and normalcy. Awareness campaigns focused on long-term isolation and unseen abuse, urging people to recognize subtle warning signs. The story became part of training materials and discussions, shifting focus from shock to prevention. What made the case endure was not its darkness alone, but what it revealed about silence. Evil had not relied on secrecy alone, but on indifference and routine. The lesson left behind was uncomfortable yet necessary. Crimes do not always hide in